Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. There we go. Right?
Yeah.
Beautiful, nice, not so sunny evening here in Los Angeles, California. Welcome to the Chicano Studies Research Center Library. Thank you for having us here to be able to conduct this event. We're here for a great discussion. The title of the panel, right? Beyond the elections, right? Political impacts on communities of color. Right, so my name is Jonathan Collins. I'll be moderating the panel. I'm a fifth-year doctoral candidate in the political science department here at UCLA. Right, and obviously, as a student of political science, I'm extremely interested in the election. But particularly, what we're interested in as scholars of color, we're always interested in what goes on beyond just the lights, right? Because this is the stuff that tends to affect us the most, right? So when I got the opportunity to moderate this panel, it was a done deal. I couldn't wait. I just wanted to be a part of the discussion that's going to happen here today, because Tuesday, a lot of people are going to cast ballots to figure out who's going to be president of the United States. But from there, this is where the work happens, right? And we're here today with a very esteemed panel who's going to tell us kind of what to expect. Maybe open up some questions that we should be thinking about after, right? The decisions is made, the parties have been had, right? And someone else assumes the White House. So, without any further ado, I'm going to bring up David Yu. He is the director of the Institute of American Cultures, which is the overarching umbrella for all of the programs who are co-sponsoring here today. So we have Asian American Studies, we have the Chicano Research Studies Center, the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies, and the American Indian Studies program. Under this umbrella is the Institute of American Cultures, right? And we have David Yu, who's going to give us a little bit more background about the Institute and the meaning of this event here today.
So good evening. Welcome on behalf of the Institute for American Cultures and the Ethnic Studies Centers. I wanted to thank especially Chicano Studies for opening up their space, also for the Bunche Center, where we'll be going over for the reception, which is probably the most important part of our program, right? Speakers have to compete against food, which is not always really good. I also want to thank the staff members of all the Ethnic Studies Centers for kind of coordinating and pulling this together. You know, without them, we wouldn't really be able to be here. And also to the speakers who took time out of their schedule. And of course, they're being paid nothing to be here, right? Because they're UCLA faculty. But it's part of their service. And to all of you for taking time out to come to have this discussion, which I think it will be really an important one. Probably not one that you're going to see on a lot of TV stations, right? So I'm a U.S. historian by background, and so often in many of my classes, I would tell students that it would be difficult to make up a lot of the things that have happened in U.S. history. There can be this kind of surreal nature of the things that have happened in our past. And sometimes I feel like that even in our present, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Right? Like, who would have thought that Donald Trump really would be a viable candidate for president of the United States?
I still don't think he's a viable candidate.
It's still like I thought, this could not really be taking place. Maybe I'm actually in a dream or a nightmare or whatever you want to say, right? But then I realized that things like there was a B movie actor that became governor and then president of the United States in the past. You remember that? That's still sometimes, I feel like, did that really happen? So it's an interesting time that we live in. And so I think it's great that we have folks here who have expertise, who are going to try to raise some questions and issues for us to think about, and then for us to have a conversation. So I'm really looking forward to what they have to say, and thank you again.
I want to start by, the next thing I want to do is introduce the panelists, right? The folks who are going to lead this discussion. We're going to start from, I guess we'll work our way from the far right. Well, my far right, your far left. Right? We're back to me. We have, in the corner, we have Professor Randy Akee. He's an assistant professor of public policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. His main research interests are labor economics, economic development, migration, ethnicity, and development politics. Can we give Professor Akee a hand? Next to Professor Akee, we have Professor Shannon Speed. She's the director of the American Indian Studies Center right here at UCLA, and she's also associate professor of anthropology and gender studies. Her research focuses on indigenous women migrants from Mexico and Central America, and immigration detention in Texas. Could we give a hand for team research? Next to Shannon, we have Professor Frasure-Yokley, who is a associate professor of political science. Her research interests include racial and ethnic politics, political behavior, state and local governance, and the political economy of metropolitan areas. Thank you. Welcome, Professor. Next, we have Professor Paul Ong. He's a professor at the Luskin School of Public Affairs and the Asian American Studies Department. He directs the UCLA Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, and his research includes civic and political participation, right? Economic status of minorities, and environmental inequality. Give a hand for Professor Ong. And last but certainly not least, we have Professor Rivera-Salgado. He received his PhD in sociology from University of California, Santa Cruz. He's currently the director at the UCLA Center for Labor Research and Education, where he teaches classes on work, labor and social justice in the U.S., and also immigration issues. Right? He also directs the Institute for Transnational Social Change. He has extensive experience as an independent consultant on transnational migration, race, and ethnic relations, as well as diversity trainings for large organizations. Among his most recent publications includes Indigenous Mexican Migrant in the United States, and the recently published volume with Ed Tellis and also UCLA colleague Mark Sawyer, Just Neighbors, Research on African American and Latino Relations in the United States. Give a hand for All right. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into the discussion. I know the one thing that we wanted to start with is hear a little bit from Professor Ong. The rarity of this conversation is that we hardly ever get to have conversations across racial and ethnic lines, right? This is something that makes this conversation unique. This is something that makes the Institute of American Cultures unique, right? So we want to start by talking about, the landscape in LA, which is arguably one of the most multicultural, multi-ethnic city in our society, right? Or at least one of, definitely for sure. So we want to talk about the kind of like multiracial, multi-ethnic composition in LA, and what the implications are of the diversity we have in our city for the upcoming election that's happening in a week or so. So Professor Ong, could you sort of talk more about this concept of sort of racial difference in neighborhood and diversity?
It's both narrow and broad. It's narrow because I'm just going to talk about voting and voting patterns. And that's not the only aspect of political engagement. There are other aspects, but it's an important part. But it's also very broad in the sense that I will cover not just this election, but what's happened in the past and what we need to do in the future. I also take Tip O'Neill's cliche that all politics is local to heart. And so looking at Los Angeles, certainly we're going to localize it. But Los Angeles in many ways is typical of not just this region, but the rest of the US. So many things, the patterns we see here are applicable to other parts of the country. I want to thank Sylvia Gonzalez. She's back there. She's been working on this through the graduate summer mentorship. So what we've been trying to do is understand the patterns of political engagement through electoral politics, particularly voting. And so, next slide. So I'm going to start off with, this is the broadest view. If you could think about political power in terms of voting, one way we want to see is the level of engagement and representation. So this map gives you a sense of that. And essentially, this is the number of voters per population by neighborhoods. And the dark blue areas is the highest level. The red is the lowest level. The range is roughly about two to three times higher from the highest to lowest. So we're talking about huge discrepancies in terms of the ability to voice through voting to represent populations. And so if you know Los Angeles well enough, and I hope you guys do, you could quickly sort of identify your own neighborhood. I noticed when we put this up, our students like to go up to the map and sort of point, I live here, right? And so that's the reference point. But you could also get a sense, because we know this area, we know where South Los Angeles is at, we know where Bel Air is at, we know the coastal area and what that represents. And so you begin mentally understanding that these spatial patterns overlay heavily on top of socioeconomic differences as well as demographic, racial, ethnic differences. Next slide. So here's a representation of Los Angeles in terms of areas by majority group. So yellow represent Latino majority, green majority African American, blue majority non-Hispanic white, red majority Asian Americans. If you could just flip back and forth between the two so people get sort of mental sort of sense of it. Okay, so one of the things we want to do is we know that many of the areas that are minority tend to be overrepresented and actually underrepresented too. And so again, you could see that, for example, in the African American corridor, actually it has a high proportion of voters per population. Whereas the Asian areas and some of the Latino areas, very low. So what I want to do is just decompose that a little bit into 3 steps. So next slide. So we could decompose it by looking at the adult population, for example, that are citizens eligible to vote. We're talking about adults. And so we do this in terms of a percentage of the adult population that's eligible to vote and arrange it by the majority area. The colors corresponds with the map, if you remember the map. Thank you. And so that's the first step. You have to be eligible to register. And we see variations in eligibility. Part of it is because of immigration, but not just immigration. But then if we look at registration rate, that is after you become eligible, do you go out to register? And there you see gaps also, differences in variation. And the final one is, do you, after you register, turn out to vote, right? And again, we see systematic differences. And so these are ways we understand to describe the sort of gap in voting power as it sort of builds up across the 3 steps. So there are 3 things that we could do about it. And for those who are engaged in community activism, this is nothing new to you. So I'm just repeating what you know. One is naturalization drives, citizenship classes, getting people to be prepared so they can become citizens. The second one in terms of registration is registration drives. This is where you go to the grocery store and somebody says, are you registered? Strange things to find in a neighborhood. I notice in different neighborhoods, if I am in San Gabriel Valley, I get approached. If I'm on the west side, they kind of sort of ignore me as if I'm not going by. I don't know why. I just notice a pattern. I'm a social scientist. I notice a pattern. And finally, in terms of equalizing, getting out there to cast your ballot, we have get out the vote drives. So there are solutions out there in terms of how we, in these 3 different steps, after we decompose what creates that differences in representation, efforts and strategies do that. So that's great, and community groups are actively involved in this. So the question is, what can we do here at the university? It seems to me that there are 3 things that we ought to be doing. One is, certainly we need to be engaged as individuals and have our students engaged as individuals to participate through voluntarism. That is, actually go out and work with those groups that are trying to do these drives. that is part of our civic responsibility, in my opinion. That is, through that volunteerism, we make a contribution. But we need to go farther than that. Here at the university, we're not just about promoting civic engagement. We clearly want to do that. Two other things, and I'll wrap it up. One is that we ought to really be doing research on policies and practices, and as well as other structural features that makes a difference. I'm impressed, for example, Janelle Wong, who's at Maryland now. I am fascinated by some of the research she did when she was a much younger scholar. Getting out the vote, you have different strategies. You call them up, right? You send cards and so forth. Do we know what really works? And her research tries to unravel that through experimental design. And I think that's an innovative application of what we do as scholars and researchers in the service of promoting political power. And the final thing, the third thing that we could do is that we have to realize, as much as these community groups, advocacy groups are engaged and committed to work, the foundations that support them, resources are limited. I'm sorry to say that. I'm an economist by training. We always think about the world about having constraints, and that's reality. So another thing we could do is do the type of research that helps target our efforts to get the maximum returns to it. And what that means, and why we were doing this project, Sylvia and I are doing this, actually we're trying to get drilled down not just to the neighborhood, but by different ethnic groups in terms of their eligibility rate, the registration rate, the voter rates. We're applying some sort of more advanced Bayesian type surname imputation, and we're gathering registration roll across years to do this sort of work. But one of the purpose, besides trying to get published, because we got to get published, right? That's what we're about. But the other reason we're engaged in this is that we're trying to work with community groups so they could understand the patterns and where the barriers and the opportunities are, based on facts and based on empirical evidence. So I think there are things that we should consider doing in terms of, as scholars, researchers, as students, that addresses that gap in terms of representation. Thank you.
It's good to be here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about changing demographics in the U.S. as they relate particularly to the 2012 electorate. And as we look beyond the 2016 election and we get geared up in the next 10, 12 days or so for the 2016 election, it's important for us to reflect on factors related to race and ethnicity in 2016, because we need to begin to think about how those factors are going to play out in 2016. So we're going to give some facts about race and ethnicity and voter turnout in 2012. We're going to look at the persistent voter turnout disparities, particularly related to SES, inequality, and voter mobilization. So I have about 3 or 4 minutes of some remarks, and then really quick go over some promising practices and piggyback on Paul's comments with regards to voter mobilization. So first, quickly, most of us are aware of the changing demographics in the U.S. electorate and the fact that racial and ethnic minorities made up nearly 1/3 of all voters in the 2012 election, which was a record high share. In terms of race, ethnicity, and voter turnout, the number of white voters dropped by 2 million in 2012, the first drop in absolute terms for any racial or ethnic group since 1996. And in fact, these voters, by 2 million, these white voters are in fact what the Trump campaign possibly is counting on coming back into the electorate. White voter turnout was 64%, which fell from 66% in 2008. While Latinos are the fastest growing demographic group, they make up a smaller share of eligible voters, but because many are still children and non-citizens and ineligible to vote, Latino turnout dipped slightly from 49.9% in 2008 to 48%, and Asian American turnout was basically unchanged between 2008 and 2012. Now let's look at African Americans a little bit closer. Blacks were the only racial and ethnic group to show an increase in turnout in 2012. 66% of eligible blacks cast ballots in 2012, up from 64% in 2008. Black voter turnout passed whites in 2012, increasing 1.7% between 2008 and 2012. Now, black female voter turnout, which was given some lip service when Clinton went to South Carolina and other places of the South during the primaries, but we've yet to hear more about the role of black women and black voter with regards to black voter turnout and the importance of black women to the Democratic Party. Black female voter turnout passed whites in 2008 and 2012. This table shows you these facts. And then I'm going to disaggregate by gender and race. So here it's just showing that black voter turnout increased and passed that of whites in 2012. And then we look at black female voter turnout outpacing that of whites, as well as all other racial and ethnic groups in terms of gender, both in 2008 and 2012. And this is using CPS data. So in terms of age and ethnicity and turnout, 41% of voters 18 to 24 cast the ballot in 2012, and this fell from 2008. The drop was greatest among young whites, whose voter turnout fell from 2008 to 2012 from 49% to 42%, but black youth voter turnout also decreased. The Latino youth voter turnout decreased from 39% to 34%, and the only age subgroups showing an increase in voter turnout in 2012 was among blacks ages 45 to 64, as well as blacks 65 and over. Now let's relate this to disparities and persistent disparities in political participation, the so-called mobilization bias. So those with higher socioeconomic status are more likely to participate, in part because they are more likely recruited to the process. The mobilization bias also finds that previous research confirms that people of color are disproportionately less likely to be asked to participate by politicians as well as activists. They are especially less likely to be contacted by whites. Individuals of lesser social status are forced to rely on the political mobilization of organized community groups, community-based organizations, for example, religious organizations, more heavily than are individuals with higher SES. Now let's look at how this showed out in the data. Now I'm going to show you very briefly some data from the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Study. And this was the first large-scale, multilingual, multi-ethnic survey of racial and ethnic voters done in a post-election framework. It was first conducted in 2008. Janelle Wong was a part of it. And it was conducted in 2012, and it will be conducted in 2016 with a projected sample size of about 10,000. And it's the first multiracial, multilingual co-op where we have been joined by 45 campuses all around the country to conduct this really large survey. But in 2012, with regards to being asked to register to vote, so one might look at this, and this is the standard question about were you contacted to register or to vote in the 2012, 12 months prior to the election. And this shows that blacks were, on average, more likely to be contacted than whites and Hispanics. So we might, have a pause for a little bit of joy here. But when we disaggregate and we look at who contacted you, as well as the kind of contact, and I'll get to that in a second. In terms of being contacted by a candidate, whites on average were more likely to be contacted by a candidate. In terms of a political party, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, whites were more likely to be contacted in 2012 by a political party. What about in terms of an independent group? Whites were more likely than the other two groups to be contacted by an independent group. And what about a nonpartisan group? Again, in this way, whites were the least likely to be contacted. Latinos were the most likely to be contacted by a nonpartisan group in their community. How were you contacted? Mail, phone, in person, or via email? In terms of mail, whites were slightly more likely than African Americans to be contacted, with Latinos the least likely in 2012. In terms of the telephone, whites were, on average, much more likely to be contacted via the telephone. What about in person? Blacks were on average, the least likely to be contacted in that face-to-face contact, which really matters. And in some questions that might come down the pipeline in our minutes to come, I'll talk more about the role in the recent data by my colleagues and I on the important role of being asked in person to turn out to vote. And then what about email? Latinos were the least likely to be contacted in 2012 via email. Now the implications. In 2008 and 2012, great attention was paid to the gender gap, the youth vote, and particularly the Latino vote with regards to mobilization and turnout. Black voter turnout was largely overlooked and seen by most as a no-brainer. If blacks turned out to vote at all, they would overwhelmingly choose President Obama. So why should we care about the black vote? Well, voter turnout and vote choice are not equal. And so what we need to focus on again is the so-called what happens after the Obama effect, particularly within this election season, and that voter turnout does not equal vote choice, all right? So these groups still need to be mobilized to the ballot box. The implications: we must continue to examine and promote voter registration efforts, to piggyback on Paul's comments, get out the vote, and other kinds of efforts, election reform laws, voter ID laws, trimming, the extent to which there's been a trimming of early voting days, voting lines disparities and egregious wait times, as well as voter suppression tactics. And it just seems as though we've taken our eye off the ball this year, particularly with regards to the role of voter suppression and what that might mean in 2016. There's been so much going on in the election that we've sort of taken our eye off the ball there, seemingly. And this is important because vote method matters. In terms of voting at the polls, blacks were more likely to vote at the polls, slightly more likely than whites in 2012. In terms of early voting, blacks were more likely than the other two racial ethnic groups to vote early. And in terms of voting by mail or absentee ballot, blacks were the least likely to vote in this way. In terms of asking the question about voter ID, we asked the question, should everyone have be required to have a driver's license or state-issued voter ID? And so this is just sort of trying to figure out how different racial ethnic groups feel about these efforts. And so blacks were, on average, the least likely to strongly agree with this question about whether or not you should have a state-issued driver's license or voter ID to vote. So my last couple of slides are just about promising practices. Again, I echo Paul's call to action. Studies suggest that door-to-door or face-to-face interactions have demonstrated their effectiveness in encouraging people of color to become more civically and politically involved. People of the same racial ethnic group have shown to be better at contacting those of the same in-group. And some asking people to participate and giving them a reason to do so over and again shows, both from experiments and other forms of empirical research such as surveys, to have a increased higher rates of civic and political participation. I'm gonna go quickly over here because this is just some promising practices in terms of the youth vote, which we all are continually concerned about. Just pointing out that voting is habitual and encouraging youth to do it again and again and again, right? And also, I want to go over one quick promising practice related to community outreach. Past organizing has demonstrated that meeting people where they are, that is focusing on local issues that they already see as important to their life and the quality of their life, is the first step in terms of getting people involved. Successful mobilization efforts, particularly those that are face-to-face, begin by finding consensus, not by creating it. Successful work around a specific issue can then be used to move on to larger, more complex issues in our communities. Thanks.
Thank you again, Professor Frasure-Yokley, for your excellent presentation on voting patterns, right, and mobilization tactics in previous elections, looking at racial differences. The data that she's looking at, the CNPS, move dance, right, is a very, very innovative survey. I think we're going to look back at this period and the work that she was doing with Janelle Wong and Moderator, and soon to be David Yu, right? They're going to look back at this research, and we're going to realize that this was one of the defining moments of the study of multiracial and multi-ethnic, both coalitions, political preferences, political behavior. Next, we want to transition to Professor Akee and also Professor Speed. Right? So I think Professor Ong built an important foundation for us. We looked at sort of differences by neighborhood type, and we looked at different sort of patterns in living and neighborhood within the context of LA. I think Professor Frasure-Yokley took us national with these racial and ethnic differences. And I think Professor Akee and Professor Speed are going to actually take us back to the issue of income inequality, which kind of sits at the crux of some of the difference that we see geographically with Professor Ong's presentation. So without further ado, we're going to go to these two amazing scholars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Those were amazing presentations. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. One of the things, of course, that stood out for me, and maybe some of you noticed it too, is that American Indians weren't included anywhere on them. That doesn't surprise me at all, because I'm not a specialist in Native American voting or anything like that, but I follow it around elections. I'm interested in what's happening with Native peoples, and what you find, and we were just commenting on this before the event started, is that there's virtually no information out there. And you're regularly told, yeah, there's no information out there because the numbers aren't large enough to be significant, so we just didn't include them, which you can imagine how that often makes Native Americans feel. Native Americans are 1.7% of the population in the United States, and they have the lowest voter turnout rate of any group in the country, at about 47%. So for most people, including those who fund research and other folks who are trying to look at significant groups that may shift voting in this country in big ways, Native Americans are just not really of interest. And that results in a couple of things. It results in, and I should say, there's several important things it aligns, one of which is that in some states, we're a much more significant percent of the voting population, right? And so while that may not matter in terms of presidential elections, it often can make the difference in swing states, in places where, in congressional elections, for example. Alaska, for example, has 14.7% of the population is Native, Oklahoma 9%, New Mexico 10.4%. So there's a significant enough part of the population that it matters. But even in places where that isn't true, some of us still care about Native American enfranchisement, right? And so there's a couple things I wanted to raise about that kind of stand out for me. One is that, in terms of voter registration, and mobilizing the vote, Native Americans stay away from voting partly for historic reasons. They weren't given the vote until 1924. In some states, they didn't get the vote until well into the 1950s because they were subject to state voting laws. But there are also a whole series of things, some of which were mentioned in the last presentation, that impede people from being able to get to the polls or being able to register. Voter registration laws, which require voter ID, significantly impacts Native communities because for most of them, they are sovereign nations which issue their own IDs, right? And so many tribal members may use that, including passports, right, for international travel for some tribes. So they may not have a state-issued ID or a passport or some kind of ID like that they can use to register or to vote. Also, for some tribes who are on reserve lands or tribal areas that are extensive, it may be more than a 2-hour drive to get to a polling booth. And since polling booths were pulled off tribal reservations because there were ostensibly problems with certifying votes in tribal territories, people have to often go off reservation to get to those. And a lawsuit that was brought to try to push that issue, the 7 tribes that brought the suit were ruled against. So even efforts to try to turn that around have been kind of turned back. So there are a whole series of things like that really long lines at the voting booths, like 5 or 6 hours of lines at voting booths, that kind of thing, really, really significantly impede the vote. But beyond that, I think there's two things that that really affect Native American voting, and those are that Native Americans want to see that the outcome of those political decisions will actually have some effect on our communities, right? And so for much of US history, we haven't seen a lot of that. I think it's really significant that Native Americans do tend to vote Democrat across the country, except for in Arizona and Oklahoma. And even that may shift, I think, a little bit in this election, but they voted overwhelmingly. The Native Americans who did vote voted 70% for Barack Obama in 2012. So, you know, they are voting and voting more, but people want to see an outcome of that. So how do we see outcomes of that? Barack Obama did a lot to help with this because he actually engaged with Native communities. He passed national level legislation like the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act and the Tribal Law and Order Act, which directly impacted Native communities. He settled long-standing lawsuits with Native tribes like the Cobell case, like the Navajo Nation case, which were billion-dollar and million-dollar cases respectively. That goes a long way, right? And he organized an annual conference of Native leaders at the White House. In other words, electing Obama did something for Native Americans, and people see that, and that makes them want to go to the voting booth again next time. The other thing is that Native Americans really need to see Native candidates on the ballots, right? And so we are seeing some improvement there. We have more candidates. This year there are 90 Native American candidates on ballots for federal and state elections, so that's pretty huge for us. And I think there are also now efforts not just to mobilize the Native vote, and we do have good efforts to mobilize the Native vote, particularly in California. We had a great effort this year and voter registration rates are up, but also efforts that are a little bit longer term in terms of fostering leadership so that Native Americans from youth are being taught to think about going into leadership positions and actually stepping up for this kind of thing. So I think those are trends that will have much more of an effect over time than big campaigns of people calling Native Americans up to say, could you go out and vote, right? So those are just some of the dynamics around Native voting that I wanted to mention as a setup for Randy's comments on economic inequality outcome of the election. Thank you.
But what I'll show you is, I don't know, sort of the outcome of voting, and specifically with regard to income inequality, which is something we all care about and we all have heard a little bit more about these days. Income inequality is, I'd argue, is a direct outcome of our political process. It's about tax policy. It's about sort of compounding this sort of the lack of intergenerational transmission of economic opportunities, specifically for color populations of color, people of color. And this is just some data, and I'll just show you, I only have 5 slides here, some interesting work that I'm doing with 2 colleagues of mine at the US Census Bureau. So again, I have a disclaimer that none of this represents the opinions of the US Census Bureau, it's just us as the authors. I have to say that. What this shows, for instance, is over the last 14 years, what this data is IRS data, so 1040 data. We've merged it to US Census data, so we have billions of observations here for the United States. It's like 150 million observations per year, and we've got about 15 years worth of data. And what that allows us to do is look at the changes year by year for the ethnic and racial groups that typically we don't have. As Shannon was mentioning, we actually have American Indian, Alaska Natives separately identified here, as well as Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, as well as the bigger ethnic racial groups, Hispanic, Black, Asian, and other is multi-race category. The purpose of showing this is what's happened to the spread of income, the top part of the income distribution and the low part of the income distribution, the 90th percentile, so the individuals at the 90th percentile, compared to those at the 10th percentile by race. So what you see here is starting off in the early 2000s, there's huge disparities. This average log rate of 2.5 is something like a 12 times difference, right? Sort of the average annual income for Asians in 2000 is about 12 times that at the 90th percentile, 12 times that of the 10th percentile. right? The average income level. And you see that's been increasing over time. Each, because these are logs, this is something like a 10%, is that right? 10 or 15% increase over time. What you're seeing is an increase in income inequality across ethnic and racial groups. You can see American Indians, or the black and orange lines. 2007 is due to the Bush rebate. There's a whole bunch of stories going in there, so that's a long story. But essentially you see everybody is going up in terms of the inequality, except for these groups down here, and that's black and Hispanic. There's less economic growth going on for these two groups. PI is the other group as well, down here. But you see there's a huge upward trend. This has to be, again, I don't have any causal story right now, but I know that it's due to, this is clearly due in post-Great Recession era as well. But it has to do with sort of taxes. All right. The other thing that I'll show you is, so the last slide was income inequality and the growth in income inequality. This slide is about income mobility. What's the chances of you moving up year by year in the income distribution? So if you were sort of person 1 million in the US income distribution, what are the chances that you're gonna move up to 999,000, whatever it is? And what this is showing, again, by all racial and ethnic groups in the United States over time, is that it's sort of a movement closer to 1 means immobility, that we're not changing our positions. And what you see is that that has sort of coalesced into a less mobile society. We are less likely from the year 2000 to 2014 to have mobility in our, on average for all racial ethnic groups, but in particular for Asians are sort of the highest level of immobility, the least likely to move. Again, across income percentiles. If you want to see what we can do with the data, which I'll just briefly show you, it's disaggregated for some of the bigger groups like Asian and Hispanic, and you can see some of the within group changes, such as, so this is the same sort of thing. You see that Puerto Ricans are the least likely to have any movement in their mobility over time. Over the years 2000 to 2014, and the ones that we observe having the most mobility are South Americans and Central Americans, right? Another way of looking at this exact same thing is just using the same data, looks at for black, and black is inclusive of African Americans, recent immigrants from the continent of Africa, as well as Haitians and Jamaicans. But in the year 2000, if you started off in the first decile, the first bin, 20th, 0 to 20% of the income distribution, what's the probability that you'd still be in that income bin, right? So the lowest 20% by the year 2014. So we can follow the same person, right? So this is not sort of looking on average, this is looking at the same people over time. The probability that you'd be stuck there, again, this is an additional measure of immobility for these populations, is 62%, right? And if you started off in the second bin, so 20 to 40% of the income distribution, the probability of being stuck there in the year 2014, 15 years later, is about 40%, or sliding back is almost 30%, right? So ending up at the lower bin. And if you look, that's sort of the case all the way down. The chances of going up are always less frequent than the chances of sliding down for this population in particular. If we compare it to another group, Asian, we see a stark difference. There's essentially two positions that are sort of remaining immobile, that's sort of at the upper part of the income distribution and at the lower part of the income distribution. And in the middle, there's more churn going on. So it's so there's stark differences across ethnic and racial groups in the United States. Understanding this is part of what I think much of us are interested in, why this is going on. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, we've heard a lot about sort of the income inequality and the top 1% and the top 10% and the amount of income that's sort of accumulating at that part. And there's nothing new about that. That's research that's been shown before. So in the year 2000, the top 10% of income earners got about 40% of the US income, right? Sort of 40% of the pie in the United States went to 10% of the population. And we sort of know that. The top 1% got, almost 18%. The top 0.1% got about 9%. We know that. And the bottom 10% got 1%. What we can do is tell you the distribution by race and ethnicity. So what this tells us is that the top 10%, of that 40%, almost 90% of it went to non-Hispanic whites, right? Their share of that population, so this is working age population, so non-Hispanic whites are about 75% of the population, right? We're not talking about children, we're talking about people who file taxes, the tax filer. So they're about 75% of the population. So you see that they're getting more than their proportionate share of even the top, right? It's sort of adding insult to injury, right? It's inequality on top of inequality. Hispanics get about 2% of that amount, and they're about 9, almost 10% of the population. So again, underrepresented. Blacks are get about 2% of that and are about 10% of this population. AIN get about 1/4%, but are still about 0.8%. Asians are overrepresented. They're the only group combined with whites that are overrepresented in this group. NHPI, other, underrepresented. If we look at the bottom, we see non-Hispanic whites are underrepresented, right? They're about 54% of the low group. Hispanics are overrepresented here. They're about 19% when their population average is about 10%. Same thing for Black, same thing for AIN. And again, Asian is overrepresented. It's the only group that's overrepresented at the two ends of the distribution. So it's incredibly interesting. And it, again, argues for the heterogeneity, the variation within these various communities. And then this is the same thing by 2014. And then this is the same thing. One can disaggregate, as I said, Asian by the various subgroups. So again, this is the top 10 income shares by race. And you see that the sort of above, if everybody were getting essentially their equal share of the 10%, you'd see sort of a horizontal line here. And you see that Asian, Indian, and Chinese are essentially within the Asian group sort of outperforming or getting more than their proportionate share. And the other groups below here within the Asian category are sort of getting proportionately less. And the lowest proportionate share is Vietnamese. So that's all the results that I have. But ultimately, I guess the results that I want to the emphasis that I want to put on this is that voting matters, and this is one dimension that's clearly an important aspect of that, and it affects different communities of color differentially.
Thank you again, Professor Speed, for giving us background about American Indian, Native American political participation patterns and trends, and then Professor Akee for coming in and really talking about the role of income inequality, right, and how the stakes are really high, and they've been growing over the past couple of election cycles, right? And we want to finish with we'll obviously have time for a little bit of Q&A if possible. With our last presenter, we want to bring up Professor Rivera-Salgado. He's going to talk about the politics around labor migration and also the implications for Latino politics within this upcoming election as well.
Thank you. So what a timely discussion. I've been following the election very closely, especially as how it's framing the immigration debate. As all of you know, the last 10 years, the immigration debate has been at the forefront of the political agenda, starting in December of 2005, when the Sensenbrenner bill was introduced in the House of Representatives. That really triggered huge mobilization on the part of mostly the Latino community, but also other allies came into the scene. In the spring of 2006, we know it as the spring of resistance for immigrants. There were two massive mobilizations here in Los Angeles in April, and then on May 1st of that year, those two mobilizations combined mobilized over 1 million people. So that was incredible, and that was a moment where people were thinking about the awakening of the giant, right? The promise, because the population, especially in California, had changed dramatically with the increase of Latinos. And so people were expecting, they had a lot of expectations in terms of what was going to be the political stance of this community vis-a-vis the attacks that were taking place. So there was a lot of promise, actually, with the election of President Obama about this issue. And we're living kind of an interesting moment where the Mark Barreto, who's not here, who leads this research on Latino decisions 2016, survey the Latino community in terms of the top 3 political issues that interest Latinos, and at the top of the agenda is immigration. And immigration can cut in very different ways for the Latino community. On the one hand, you have to come to terms with the fact that under the Obama administration, he has the highest number of deportation in the history of this country. And that is interesting because for a long time, especially after the mobilizations of 2006, the idea was that there was going to be a political alignment to finally undertake immigration reform in Congress. Of course, that didn't happen, and for many different reasons. It's complicated. The way some operators of the Obama administration said, well, you know, we have big policy items taking off. Healthcare reform, of course, is on the line, waiting to take off. Then unions were pushing for labor reform, and the immigrants were at the back of the line waiting for immigration reform. Of course, the big ticket item that took off was healthcare reform, but then there was no cooperation on the part of Congress. So we end up with this interesting paradox where, on the one hand, immigrants have not fared very well, actually, in terms of the number one issue, achieving immigration reform under the 2 Obama terms. On the other hand, immigration is again also at the top of the political agenda, only in very negative ways, right? For the first time, I'm feeling how is it to be talked about as a problem, the problem of immigration and all these immigrants. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about how polarized the discourse about immigration and religion has become. People openly, yell at each other, go back to your country. And really, immigration on the one hand has become, for the political platform of Trump, a rallying cry for the right. And there seems to be, an alignment there, especially for the very conservative wing of the right. On the other hand, immigration has not surfaced as a top of the agenda under Hillary Clinton. There are other things. So this is an interesting paradox, and I think the other interesting thing is how the political participation of Latinos. So it's interesting to read the Spanish-speaking press, and there was this very interesting article in El País, the Spaniard international version, where on the front page, early this year, the front page news was that there were 2 Latinos as part of the primary elections on the Republican ticket. And that was interesting because living here in the United States is like, okay, so Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, actually, it is true. There were 2 Latinos vying for the nomination on the Republican ticket. That is interesting. And it sort of makes us reflect about the enormous variation in the political spectrum within the Latino community. And as Professor Aon said, all politics are local. If you look at the different regions of the country, especially in those regions where Latinos have political power, if we compare, for example, Los Angeles with Miami, it's going to be interesting, the big gap for and the different political representations within the Latino community. And that is changing. And of course, that says a lot about the challenge, I think, for the Latino community in terms of, on the one hand, trying to really come up with a unifying political platform. Where is it, and this is part of Matt's research, what is it that unites Latinos as a voting bloc? And I think that has been one of the toughest issues, because you have a lot of political cultures represented here. Just in Los Angeles, for example, we do a lot of work with unions. And it's interesting to see how the political culture of different Latino immigrants shapes their political engagement in Los Angeles. So just compare Mexican and Salvadorans, for example. Big cohort of Salvadoran immigrants were fleeing the Civil War in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And when they arrived to this country, they were very politicized. Actually, if you look at the history of labor and how it was revived in Los Angeles, it was those unions that targeted these immigrants, the Justice for Janitors campaign, that sort of started the revival of labor in the mid-1990s. And it was interesting because they tap onto this rich political culture that Central Americans were bringing here. Whereas if you see at how much longer Mexicans took to build and construct political organizations, they didn't have the Carecen, they didn't have the Chirlas, they didn't have the unions that Salvadoran immigrants built in a very short period of time. However, you have a longer presence of Mexican Americans, and I think that's the changing demographics in LA, where from unions, from political office, a lot of Central Americans, especially Salvadorans, say, well, in this politics of identity, where is our voice? Where is our representation? Especially as Latinos are taking power at the city council, in school boards, in unions. Really, the political holders here are the established Mexican American population. And this is the same in for example, you can start thinking about also the situation of Cuban Americans in Miami, in Florida, which is an interesting state to watch, because as the younger population increases, the politics of the Cuban American population is also changing. With influx of other immigrants, especially Puerto Ricans in that area, especially South Americans, also the older generation that came of age after the Cuban Revolution that went to Miami, also is changing. So this is why Latino elected officials from that area, especially like Marco Rubio, are in trouble with their own Latino community, right? And so you can start thinking about many different aspects in this election, but one aspect is the limits, the advantages and the limits of identity politics, especially within the Latino population. One big challenge, this population is multiracial, multinational, and also multilingual. You not only have Spanish speakers, right? You have other Portuguese speakers from Brazil, but also within Mexico, you have non-Spanish speakers, indigenous populations, Mayan populations that are coming from Guatemala. And so those issues also play a role in terms of the challenges of really coming up with a single political platform. So I think that's one of the challenges, the promise of the awakening of the giant, the fact that immigration is at the top of the political issues of this population. So it's going to be interesting how at the end, especially in those swing states, Latinos are going to behave. Are they going to continue supporting the Democratic Party? Are they going to become disenchanted? Is there a generational gap? A lot of young Latinos were strongly supporting Bernie Sanders. And you can see the big debates. We have, and I close with this, we have the Dream Resource Center at the Downtown Labor Center. It is a project led by young undocumented immigrants. And they were first defenders of Bernie Sanders. And they're very disenchanted, actually, about this idea that they feel excluded from the political process. So it's interesting to see that political attitudes information, right? These are young Latinos who many of them cannot vote, but they're very political active, which is one of the paradoxes of the Latino community. You can be undocumented, but you can be active too. And unions have tapped onto that. A lot of their get out the vote strategies rely on a lot of their members. Unions are going in great numbers to Nevada, Arizona, Colorado to get out the vote because, of course, California is already taken care of, right? And so they're investing a lot of money and mobilizing a lot of these immigrant members to help in those close elections. So it's interesting to start seeing these the development of this political identity and ideology among these young people in this context. And I think the other caveat is that these elections are so polarized. I think that that's one of the other things. I don't know how we're gonna wake up after November 8 and how we're gonna start talking to one another, right? I mean, California is not an issue, but in other places. And I think for Latinos, you know, in the places where they're arriving, especially the number one destination is states in the South, Alabama, Georgia, and in the Midwest, in Nebraska, where they're trying to really integrate into the social fabric of those communities. It's going to be interesting how they're going to do that after this election that is so polarized. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rivera-Salgado. I think we want to go into questions right away. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to pose to the panelists, but then we want to get some input from anybody else who wants to ask a question. And if you want to direct a question towards a particular member on the panel, please do so. But we ask that before you ask your question, just kind of introduce yourself, tell us your name, and stand. And stand. Yeah. Stand and be recognized, right? So I'm going to get things started in terms of the questions. And any of the panelists, you are free to.
Should we go straight back? Should we go straight to the audience? I'm not sure how much time we have.
Sure.
We only have 15 minutes, right?
Sure. Yeah. If there's a panelist with a burning question, that was your time. If not, we have a question posed. But is there anybody, especially students? It's always good to hear from students at these events, right? You know, we as a university are here to serve the students. Opportunity to have a dialogue with professors and faculty members who are leading the thought discussion on these ideas we did. In the front, here we go.
Oh, thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Joey. I'm finishing up my master's this fall in December in education. So for anyone, and you don't have to have an answer. It's just, but I feel like it's important to engage this increasingly over time and the future, just from here on. But I'm trying to think. I hadn't. It wasn't a question. I was trying to remember what I was thinking. Can anyone talk about issues of people, the barriers for people of color with disabilities, to voting? Because I know I'm become more aware that people with particularly people with invisible disabilities, they've been there are barriers. There may be barriers for them to vote if they're deemed not competent enough to vote. So I was wondering if anyone can talk about, you don't have to have answers. I'm not asking for answers, but if I feel like this is important to engage from here on out. So if anyone can say anything about in regards to the barriers for people of color with invisible disabilities in terms of getting in terms of being able to vote.
Any takers?
Well, my research doesn't focus on members of or people of color with disabilities, but I'm sorry. I just want to say that my research doesn't focus on specifically on groups who are people of color with disabilities. But first, I just want to say thank you for your question, because I think it really is important to look at the intersections of race and gender and other kinds of factors, particularly related to those with disabilities. How it could impact the 2016 election is with regards to access to the ballot box. And so raising questions as such that I raised in my presentation about how different factors of the electorate might be might find themselves unable to vote or have to wait in long lines, for example. So access is an important part. But again, I think your question taps into the intersectionality of race and gender and other kinds of factors that are important for people of color.
Oh yeah, disabilities, yeah. Oh, I realized like there's also barriers for people with physical disabilities, like if there are no ramps in like polling places.
We have to go over to the next question. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Shakari Byerly, a third-year PhD student in political science here at UCLA. This is for any of the panelists, but particularly for Dr. Ong. You talked about all politics is local. I'm wondering if you all could talk about ballot drop-off and any connections that we might be able to make, particularly for younger voters, to be engaged by some of the local or the statewide issues that are on the ballot.
And Shakari, can we get you to just repeat your question so that everybody can hear you in the back?
I'm wondering if any of the panelists can talk about either concerns for ballot drop-offs or opportunities to engage voters with issues at the state level or the local level, particularly in California where we do have ballot measures.
I have just one comment. I don't have an answer to your question comprehensively. One of the things is trying to reach out with information about what really matters to your life and your family's lives and your neighborhood's quality of life. And some issues are much easier to translate in terms of what's important. But for example, we have one proposition here in Los Angeles in terms of affordable housing. We have one maybe in March, April in terms of the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative. Both of those are going to have profound ramification on people's lives in terms of housing. And the question is, it is very complex to understand how that works out for renters. How does it work out for people who cannot afford their rent? Los Angeles is at the forefront and happily being the most unaffordable rental place in the country. So clearly there's an economic interest. Objectively, we understand that. But how do you then translate that into a way that's understandable, that mobilizes people so they can feel connected to it? Because to tell you the truth, lots of these initiatives and ballots do have objective impacts. But trying to understand, I'm having a hard time understanding them. And trying to connect that to your life is very difficult. I think there's an opportunity for us to be part of that discussion. How do we sort of translate those things so people can understand the impact? I think part of it is this educator's role in terms of ballots, initiatives, and so forth. And if you can get people to know that, I think that is a motivation for them to be engaged. But if it remains very abstract, even at the local level, it's hard to turn people out to get engaged in voting.
I also have another question. Now we know historically the university has been a place where a lot of faculty members and students have had to fight, right, for the opportunity to even have discussions about politics on the campus, right? Now, given the fact that, you know, having talks about politics is something that we've had to work towards to get to this point to even be able to have these types of discussions, what do we feel like the role of the university is going forward in terms of thinking about national elections, thinking about having conversations about the implications for elections, thinking about evaluating elections, you know, looking at debates and evaluating debates, evaluating the policy implications, the policy platforms that we should expect from candidates. What role does the university play? What role do faculty and students play in maybe making our electoral system, maybe making our democracy better?
Wants to tackle these issues. I'll just talk about it in my own classroom. This is, well, Jonathan, that's a great question. It's harder to do when in very large lecture halls when you are delivering information and then the breakout sessions or the discussion. for the discussion sections with the teaching assistants, there's more of a one-on-one with students. But for 200 and some odd students, it's hard to sort of have those one-on-one conversations. But I'll say two things. One is creating a climate for students to feel comfortable with presenting oppositional views to various sensitive topics. I teach pretty much everything is sensitive that I teach. And I teach courses on race, ethnicity, and politics, immigration, and a variety of sensitive topics. And I'm very, I'm sensitive to making sure that I ensure that my students, whether it's a large conference, a large lecture hall, or a seminar, that they feel comfortable and confident in expressing their views and that they respect one another's viewpoints. Now, in my smaller seminars, if I have 20 to 25 students, it's easier to put together a conversation each week, but I still maintain the same principles. So I can't speak for the university, but I can speak for what I do in the classroom, and that's creating an inclusive climate. I attract a diversity of students in my courses, and I love that, and I nurture that, whether that's in a large lecture hall where I don't have a lot of one-on-one contact, but in my smaller courses, I really cherish the opportunity to engage a diversity of opinions, and I want to help build students' confidence in presenting those opinions as they relate to the literature that I'm presenting that week, though.
I second that, and I think one of the most remarkable things, you go back to the Third World Strike, is the argument that we have to break down the walls around the university. We have to be engaged in communities, and we have made progress doing that. We need to make more progress. And so there's ways of integrating getting students connected to communities as an educational experience. So like in some of my larger classes I used to teach, I used to work with a community group that would do outreach, or they would do exit poll. And I encourage the students by giving them brownie points for participating, but I think it's an educational experience. Getting students out there, for example, to interview and tell them to be objective, don't be biased and make unhappy faces if people are not in your side, but use that as a way of learning about the world. So we could do both connecting to communities, and I am a strong believer that we need to do more in the university to connect to community, particularly disadvantaged communities. But we can also make it that educational experience. We could build it into our research in a way that we produce both scholarship and applied scholarship and pass that on.
One of the advantages that we have as a labor center is that we have a satellite office at the downtown labor center in front of MacArthur Park. And one of the most fulfilling experiences is to teach classes that have a service learning component, and also to see community scholars, for example, from the school plan policy to be housed there and have classes there in the downtown office. I think the incentives, there has to be an incentive, right? That this is something worthwhile doing, and that that people have the facilities. So, for example, one of the barriers that we have to embrace LA as our social laboratory is that it's so hard to get to downtown. Number one, there are hundreds of organizations in downtown. Unions, nonprofit organizations, immigrant-led organizations, advocacy organizations. For a student to be in a class with a service learning component, it takes them over an hour and a half by bus to get there. So we're not connected, and that's the other thing. So we have to create incentives by which engagement, involvement with all the critical thinking that we have here, all the different tools. That's a great strategy to use Embrace Los Angeles. UCLA should be the hub for everything, experts on everything that's happening in Los Angeles, right? But it's hard to do that. So how do we create incentives and infrastructure to be prepared to embrace our community? So that's a challenge.
I have a thought on that. Just following on that, I agree with everything you all have said. And I think that the insights about kind of our pedagogy in the classroom, and also with community engaged pedagogies, and also kind of insertions in the community are really, really important. But I think another thing that we can do as faculty, as graduate students, and we don't do often enough, is really weigh in ourselves on issues of public interest, right? Through, and maybe I'm just justifying all the hours I've spent writing op-ed pieces for newspapers, but it really is part of my academic work. But I think we should be weighing in on matters of public import maybe more than we always do, and that's another role that we can play.
Okay, and do we have time for another question? Right? One more question. Sure.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm a fourth year Asian American Studies major, and I have a question for Professor Rivera. This question is for Professor Rivera. So Donald Trump says that if he wins president, he will stop both DACA and DAPA. So my question is, what are at stakes? And whoever wins the presidency, what's next? And how can we, as citizens, students, and community members, stop deportations in the United States? Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and I hope my colleagues can help me with that. I think that one of the, when DACA was instituted through an executive order, people were exactly afraid of that. You live by executive order and you die by executive order, because the next president could come and just end it. And I think that's the failure of comprehensive immigration reform. Basically, that it was a band-aid, it was an easy way out to deal with immigration issues. And remember, DACA was a very limited measure. And I think there is a real possibility if Trump becomes president, of course, and we can project maybe the numbers. That's a remote possibility, but it's still a possibility. Yes, DACA can be ended through executive order. And I think the other thing is, deportations are going to continue. I think that there is that issue is very complicated, but it's tied to even, for example, how the business of deportation. Mm-hmm. One of the hidden issues here is that through Congress, there is maybe you can talk about that, the privatization of this whole issue. I mean, there is a quota that the government has to fulfill in detention centers that are owned by private companies before this. And this is, it's huge business. I mean, you start thinking about how much these centers charge per person, per day. This is a big business. And so there's a whole political economy to this deportation process. And we're talking about millions of people. So yes, that's why elections are important, right? And I think for people to get mobilized. But Shannon, you want to comment about?
Well, I think you said it rather well, but yeah, so, I mean, the immigration detention system and deportation as part of that are part of the prison industrial complex in this country. The detention of immigrants has been handed off to private corporations like the Corrections Corporation of America that house, tens of thousands of immigrants across the country, and there are congressionally mandated number of beds that must be filled regardless of whether people have been detained through immigration processes or not. So they have to then actively go out and seek people to detain in order to fill those beds, which makes it a much more aggressive process and is partly responsible for upping the numbers of people deported in this country over the last decade.
Well, I think that is not necessarily the brightest note to end on.
Yeah.
It's a factual note to end on, and that's what these conversations are about. They're about discovery. Before we head over to the reception, I just want to thank everybody in attendance. Give yourselves a hand of applause. Please remember to vote November 8th, please. We need for us to attend a panel about the election and not actually vote, so please do that. I think Professor Ong shows us that we still have a ways to go in terms of getting the voter participation where we needed to be here in Los Angeles, and that starts with each and every one of us. right? So please go out and vote. Please continue to support the ethnic studies programs here on UCLA's campus. Thank you again to the Institute of American Cultures, Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies, Chicano Studies Research Center, American Indian Research Center. Thank you, Asian American Research Center. Thank you, everybody, for putting this event together and be a part of our discussions in the future. Thank you.